Chapter 16. Sleuthing. "Singing horses," repeated the guard. "Right you are." Striding up to the gates, he opened them wide. Bess guided the car between the posts, and the portals clanged shut. The password had permitted them to enter. Both girls heaved sighs of relief as they sped up the gravel driveway. Halfway to the mansion, Nancy spoke. "Stop! No one can see us from the house yet, and the lodge is concealed by those shrubs." Bess brought the car to a halt, and Nancy said, "Back the car off the drive into that clump of trees, Bess." "Good. Lucky there's enough room. Get in as far as you can. Keep on backing. Farther. That's fine. Now you wait here. I'll return as soon as I can." "Don't be too long," said Bess, trying not to sound frightened. Nancy squeezed her friend's hand and slipped out of the car. As she went up the hill, she could hear the dog down at the gatehouse growling. "I hope he's still chained," she thought. Near the mansion, Nancy assumed a stooped posture and uncertain walk. "I must be on my guard," she told herself. Light streamed out onto the lawn from the windows of the house. Staying in the shadows, Nancy reached the walls of the mansion and made her way around to the back where she found an open door. Peering through the screen, she saw a wide, dimly lighted hallway with stairs ascending to her left, and guessed that this was a back door to the main corridor. She tested the screen. It was unlatched. "Now for a trip inside," she murmured. "I hope my new shoes don't squeak." Quietly, she stepped into the hall. Half a dozen wheelchairs stood about. 2 of them had sleeping occupants, but there was no other sign of life. Nancy moved on tiptoe toward the broad stairway and had just reached the steps when she heard the tread of feet on the oaken floor. In a flash, she darted to an empty wheelchair and muffled herself in the light woolen blanket left by its last occupant. "I'll try to look as if I'm asleep," she thought. At that moment, a young woman in a striped uniform entered the hall. Nancy watched her apprehensively, fearing that the hat and veil would excite some comment. The nurse's helper, however, marched by humming to herself, giving none of the chairs a second glance. As soon as she disappeared through a door, Nancy leaped up and dashed toward the stairs. A white head poked up from the nearest chair, and a cracked voice cried, "Hi there, my dear. The doctor seems to have more than cured you. Why, you are young again." Nancy did not pause, but with hammering heart ran up the steps to the second floor. She quickly glanced around, then started the climb to the next story. At the top of the stairs, she peered cautiously down the corridor. Empty. Relieved, Nancy tried to get her bearings. "The south corner room," Mrs. Eldridge had said. "That would be to my right." Quickly, Nancy tiptoed down the hall and stopped before the last door. She bent to look through the keyhole, but could see nothing. Then she turned the knob. The door was locked. As Nancy racked her brains to think of a way to open it, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She darted across the hall and tried the handle of the opposite door. It turned, and she stumbled into total darkness. It was not a room, but a small broom closet. It was a tight squeeze. Nancy did not dare move, for in the brief moment that the closet door was open, she had seen that the floor was filled with pails. Against the wall were mops, brooms, and other cleaning equipment. Her slightest movement would send them clattering to the floor. With her ear to the door, Nancy waited. The footsteps approached, coming her way. They stopped outside her hiding place. For an instant, she dared not breathe. Then there was the rattle of a key in a lock and the clink of china on a tray. Nancy guessed that a bedtime snack was being brought to Mrs. Eldridge. Cautiously, she opened the door and saw a white skirt vanish into Mrs. Eldridge's room. Then came Miss Tyson's harsh voice. "Wake up, Mrs. Eldridge. Here is your medicine and some food. If you don't do as the doctor says, it will be the last snack you'll taste for a long time." The patient groaned faintly, and the nurse went on speaking. "I have some nice hot consomme and toast and rice pudding. Doesn't that make your mouth water? Taste it, and remember that tomorrow there will only be stale bread and warm water for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if you don't obey our dear good Dr. Bell, who is so kind to you." An idea suddenly occurred to Nancy. If that nurse is going to lecture Mrs. Eldridge, I'll have some time to act, she decided. Swiftly, Nancy tore a strip from her veil and slipped out of the closet to the opposite door. It stood slightly ajar. With the piece of net, Nancy plugged the slot in the door frame into which the bolt of the spring lock fitted. Then she darted back to her hiding place. "I hope my scheme works," she thought. As Nancy stepped back and pulled the door shut, she bumped against a broom. The handle fell forward. Quickly, Nancy caught it and another broom which toppled. For a moment, she clutched the wooden handles in the dark, her heart pounding. Then, very cautiously, Nancy propped them against the wall again. "Oh, that's all I need," she murmured. "One noise and I'll be trapped." Miss Tyson remained to threaten Mrs. Eldridge a few minutes more, then left the room. She closed the door and, apparently thinking it was locked, hurried away. Nancy listened for her to go downstairs, then ran to the door across the hall. Her trick had worked. The bolt had failed to lock. Nancy pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Mrs. Eldridge," she said softly. The patient looked up and gave a sharp scream. Nancy flew to her side. "Don't be afraid. It's Nancy Drew, the girl who spoke to you through the fence," she whispered, quickly lifting the veil. "I'm sorry. I'm nervous," the old woman gasped. "They have tried their best to frighten me so often. How in the world did you get in?" "Don't worry about that. The thing to do now is for you to get out of here. I hope no one heard you scream." But as she spoke, she heard someone running down the hall. "I heard Mrs. Eldridge scream," came Miss Tyson's voice. "What of it?" said a second speaker. "I suppose I'll have to chase her into her room again," the nurse said irritably. "I wouldn't bother," came another voice. "But I can't let anything happen to her," said the nurse. "She hasn't signed yet?" "No." Nancy looked around the room. There was not even a clothes closet to hide in. Mrs. Eldridge groaned. "Oh, child, what will you do?" As the doorknob turned, Nancy dived under the bed. It was very dusty there, and she lay motionless, almost afraid to breathe. Nancy could see a pair of white, leather-shod feet stride into the room and pause at the foot of the bed, a few inches from her nose. "You screamed!" Miss Tyson said angrily. "Why, Miss Eldridge?" "Oh, did I?" the patient asked in a weak voice. "I am sorry." "Whether you are sorry or not makes no difference," Miss Tyson snapped. "There are other patients in the house whom you upset by carrying on that way. Why did you scream?" "I am really very sorry," Mrs. Eldridge said, trying to find some excuse for her outcry. "It won't happen again." "I asked you why," the nurse said sharply. There was no reply. "Answer my question!" exclaimed the nurse, stamping her foot and raising a cloud of dust. Nancy pressed the hat veil to her face, trying not to sneeze. The "The consomme is very hot," Mrs. Eldridge said. "I burned my tongue." "A likely story," the nurse sniffed. "The broth is not as hot as all that after being carried up from the kitchen. No, that is not the truth, Mrs. Eldridge, and I intend to find out your real reason." "Oh, Miss Tyson," begged the patient, "don't scold me. I had to make a special trip up here on your account." "That's too bad. I'm sorry." "Well, why did you scream?" "What have you been doing?" rasped the nurse. "Nothing," replied the old lady. "I haven't been out of bed." "You've been acting funny ever since this afternoon. You're up to something." Then the nurse added in a bullying tone, "You know what I'm going to do?" "What?" asked Mrs. Eldridge. "Search this room." End of chapter 16.